going to, oh, sorry. Me and Macaulay Green Initiative's lovely co-president Tareen are going to ask our panelists questions alternatingly, and then all of you guys can ask some questions at the end, and then we are going to be drawing our raffle. So I guess I'll start introducing the panelists. Next slide, please. So to start off, Jeffrey Schlegelmilch is a research scholar and director for the National Center of Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University's Earth Institute, where he oversees the operations and strategic planning for the center. Before becoming director, he served as the center's deputy director for more than 5 years. Christina Theodoridi is a policy advocate for NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, where she works on climate policies that reduce emissions from air conditioning, refrigeration, and industrial processes. Jennifer Skeen is a natural climate solutions policy manager with the Natural Resources Defense Council's Canada team, where her work focuses on primary forest protection in the Canadian boreal and other northern forests, forest carbon accounting and regulation, and the creation of Indigenous-led protected areas. She's a clinical lecturer at Yale Law School, where she previously co-directed the Environmental Protection Clinic. And Johanna Lavecchio is the associate director for the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes. She specializes in urban climate adaptation planning and public infrastructure project design, and is a forward-looking and conscious of community-based and ecosystem resilience. At CRCL, she manages the Resilience Accelerator, which delivers strategic support, technical design, and climate systems research, and intensive local workshops to advance resilience project design and implementation in partnership with local governments around the world. Yeah, and unfortunately, Thaddeus will not be able to join us today unless he makes a surprise guest appearance. Yeah. So just to start off with our first question, if all of you could please tell us a little about yourselves and your work, and maybe what your educational and career path is and how you got to where you are today.
Do you want me to? I'll jump on in. Sure.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. So it's honestly, it's an odd pathway that I took to get here. I actually had never really intended or designed my career to end up in academia. I don't know if that's a cautionary tale or if it's a, you know, it's funny. I did my undergrad in theater studies, and actually, so it seems like an odd path, but actually started in the arts and the humanities, and was very, you know, very interested in sort of the social dynamics of just our lives and sort of the dramatic elements of our lives. During that was actually I was in my third year and was changing around, doing a minor in sociology and sort of exploring alternate career paths. They have a saying in the theater: if there's anything else you can do and be happy, you should do that instead. And I enjoyed what I was doing, but it wasn't really a viable career for what the aspects that I enjoyed. And then 9/11 happened, and then so then all of a sudden there was sort of like all this different aspects emerging that from the Homeland Security perspective, from disaster preparedness, from these other fields. So I ended up doing my master's in public health. Long story on why it wasn't sociology, which ends in me not getting accepted anywhere. But so I ended up doing public health and sort of focused on international health and like global humanitarian as well as domestically. This was a time period not unlike now where we were on the other side of a very large I wouldn't necessarily say we're on the other side of COVID, but we were coming through a national tragedy, sort of figuring out where we were, and there were a lot of resources and repositioning going on. I ended up with an internship for the city of Boston that turned into a full-time job before I even graduated, doing public health preparedness, bioterrorism planning, later on pandemic planning, spent some time as an epidemiologist. Like in many municipal agencies, there's not a ton of room for upward momentum. There was some, so I ended up moving to a center in a quasi-consulting environment with the Yale New Haven Health System, and sort of where I was kind of going deep on the issues in the city of Boston, I was now going wide in terms of working with groups all over the country and even some international, working the same problem in a lot of different jurisdictions on shorter hits. And that ended up sort of leading to, I ended up focusing more on like business models and the business practices that sort of facilitate resilience and preparedness and sustainability. And was sort of looking around at what was next, and ended up applying for this position at Columbia without any intention of actually taking it, and got introduced to some great folks who were really focused on translational research, taking the research and translating that into policy and practice. And that was at the center within the Earth Institute, now part of the Climate School, and really institutionalizing this larger commitment to a type of science that's more intersectional across different domains. So it's very exciting, more exciting than it is frustrating, which is always a good thing. And you get to be part of amazing panels like this and meet folks like yourselves. So I'll stop talking and really look forward to the conversations and hearing from you and my fellow panelists.
I can jump in there. There's some through lines there and some commonalities I heard, which were kind of cool to hear. Hey, everyone. Thanks, guys, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and meet you guys and share some learnings and also hear what you're up to. I'm Joanna Lavecchio, and I guess somewhat similarly to Jeff, a lot of what motivated me to get into this field was shaped by sort of really big events that happen. I'm a born and bred New Yorker. I grew up on Long Island. And I went to college in New York City. I went to NYU. And when I was in the 8th grade, 9/11 happened. And it was very catastrophic for my community and where I lived, and really from a very young age sort of taught me about that intersectionality. And it was a moment where the whole world sort of realized how connected we all were, and how the 21st century was going to look very different than the 20th century. That sort of shaped a lot of what I was interested in and gravitated towards. And then when I was in college, I went to NYU, and I was studying urban studies, and it really shaped how I saw myself move in my own city, and realized how things were sort of not designed by accident, and that they very much reflected who and what we value as a society, and in politics and in economy. And then I decided to go get a master's in urban planning to just sort of keep immersing myself. It was sort of like New York City was my classroom, and my school was just helping me to learn about where I lived. And I wanted to keep going with that. And I got a job at the city planning department in New York as my first job. And during that job, Hurricane Sandy happened. So I had been on a project where I was looking at industrial waterfront neighborhoods across New York City that were really changing fast because the nature of manufacturing and industry is changing still in New York, and have a lot of environmental justice issues, a lot of contamination of land that make it hard to think about how to transition neighborhoods. And then right in the middle of that project, Hurricane Sandy happened. And again, was this very, very big exposure of the vulnerabilities in our communities and in my hometown, and really, really shaped the way that I thought about the role of infrastructure and who's protected, and brought into the light, right, this sort of what before that was sort of this existential threat of climate change became very, very real. And that very much shaped the rest of my path. After that, I worked in consulting, and I did work with a firm called HRNA Advisors for clients like the Rockefeller Foundation and 100 Resilient Cities, who were starting to learn a lot from events like Sandy and 9/11 about what makes for a resilient city. What does that even mean? And thinking about how to apply that in strategic plans in cities, particularly as it relates to disaster recovery. And then I had the opportunity to scale some of that work that I was working on. So running workshops, facilitation, technical assistance for cities, counties, and states around the country into a global context, because many, many places are faced with the same sort of organizational challenges of getting work done when the urgency keeps increasing more and more every year. And then I got my job at the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes at Columbia, where I have the opportunity to help sort of somewhat like Jeff was describing, translate technical, scientific, design research into policy and planning processes and design processes that are happening all around the world. Local governments and civic organizations that really need to adapt some of that research and apply it quickly and strategically. Think a little bit more long-term about climate risk and how we sort of got from where we were to where we need to go. So that's sort of my path, also winding, but some threads.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's wonderful. If Christina or Jennifer want to go next.
Happy to. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us today. It's really great to be among all of you and to discuss this. My name is Christina Theodoridi. I am, as you mentioned, Katie, in the beginning, I'm a policy advocate for NRDC, and I work on how to decarbonize the heavy industry and the cooling sector. And that is testament to how I entered this space, which is from a very technical perspective. I'm an engineer by training, and when I first started my studies, I had no idea I would end up working in climate policy. And I pursued my degree in my home country of Greece. And for my thesis, I had the privilege of working in a research institute in France that was performing some very wonky, very technical research on catalytic materials that were to be used to help the EU reach a specific climate target that it had at the time. And that was my first exposure into policy, into understanding that, you know, there are people that are thinking about a much larger picture, about a much broader trajectory of things, and that eventually translate into very specific, tangible projects, research, innovation that has to happen to reach these things. And I was fascinated by that. And after a winding path through a few odd jobs here and there, I ended up pursuing an environmental science and policy degree in the US. Actually, a degree that is affiliated with the Earth Institute that Jeffrey is affiliated with. And then shortly after that, I started this job at NRDC. And I think, you know, hearing all of you, it's important to remember that oftentimes when you think about where you want to be in a career, you don't really know how you're going to get there. And oftentimes you end up somewhere where you had, you know, it was not what you planned and not what you had in mind. And that's beautiful. That's how life works. And I think that at the end of the day, you know, curiosity and honest work will get you to a place that is fulfilling. And there's no right way to get there. You can start from an engineering degree, you can start from theater studies, you can start from literally anywhere and find your way somewhere where you can produce change. So I think that's important to remember as all of you are now embarking in your educational and career paths.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I agree in the chat. We definitely need to hear more stuff like that, especially as we're figuring out our own careers. So Jennifer, if you'd like to finish us off.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful to meet you all and to be part of this discussion today. And absolutely second everything that Christina just said. You know, my own path has been winding just like everybody else's. It actually started off in the arts, similar to Jeff's. I was a radio, TV, film major in undergrad, and had that dual with anthropology, and was intending to, or thinking about going into documentary filmmaking. But then ended up minoring in environmental policy and culture, and had the opportunity to do a summer thesis project on the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota. And while I was there working with the Anishinaabe people, really saw the impacts of, coal plants, pipeline development, and the incursion onto their land, and obviously, historical decades, centuries of colonialism. And that really spurred me to want to work at the intersection of human rights and environmental policy. So I decided to give up the easy route of pursuing film and go to law school instead. So in law school, I mostly focused on environmental work and Indigenous rights. And right after law school, was fortunate enough to get a year-long fellowship with NRDC. And basically, when I was designing that fellowship in partnership with NRDC, I was just like, I told them I was interested in international law and Indigenous rights. And they said, well, the Canada team sounds like a great fit for you. And I had been to Canada once at that point. I didn't know too much about Canadian law and policy, couldn't really pinpoint, Ottawa on a map, but I was placed with the Canada team, and am so grateful that I was. I spent a year there working primarily on issues of tar sands development and tailings ponds impacts, particularly in Alberta, and sort of the intersections with pipeline development, especially the Keystone XL pipeline in the US. After that year was up, I had actually already committed to a year-long clerkship. I wanted to sort of at least pretend that I had been to law school and have a real lawyer opportunity and experience. So I clerked for the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces in DC. And then that year made very clear to me that I really wanted to remain in the environmental field and work in the policy realm rather than litigation. So I ended up going back to NRDC, and they were kind enough to give me a consulting position there for 2 years. And at that point, they had actually transitioned to working a little less on the tar sands and more on the boreal forest, the protection of the boreal forest in Canada, and working to protect, really carbon-rich, biodiverse areas of primary forest, especially under Indigenous-led protection. And I had loved the tar sands work, but I think I really found my element in the boreal forest work. I'd always been sort of torn between wanting to work on climate issues, but also really loving sort of the nature protection and biodiversity aspects of environmental work. And this was the perfect marriage of them. And then, of course, still having a very strong Indigenous rights element. So I consulted for NRDC for 2 years and took on more and more of their climate file. And then was lucky enough to get a fellowship joint between NRDC and Yale Law School, where I spent a year in NRDC's Santa Monica office, and then spent a year teaching at Yale's Environmental Protection Clinic, which was an absolute joy to get to have that experience of teaching. And I still get to work with the students on projects throughout the semesters now, which has just been an incredible experience. But then after that fellowship, I ended up getting to come on board NRDC full-time, and I'm now working as the Natural Climate Solutions Policy Manager with the Canada team, focused on boreal forest protection, sort of leveraging policies both in Canada and the US, as well as internationally, and marketplace mechanisms to protect this really vital region.
Yeah, thank you so much. All of that is so amazing. And I love hearing how diverse everyone's paths are. I think it's really interesting. The two of our panelists started in the arts and then ended up where they are today. And I think that's really inspiring to all of our students who are figuring out what they want to do. So if Tareen wants to do our next question.
Sure. Did Eva want to leave? Okay, I can screen share. Just give me 1 second to set it up.
I think she was having technical difficulties.
Okay. Okay, so like Katie said, thank you so much for sharing all of your paths. I especially found it inspiring because I myself don't know what to do with my future and my career. But moving on to the next question. what do you think are some of the most accessible climate resiliency and mitigation strategies that exist today? And what is feasible within the United States? So if we want to go in the order of the last question, Jeffrey, if you'd like to kick us off.
Yeah, sure. It's a really good question. It's a little bit of a moving target. I say that because, what may be very accessible in one area may be very different in another. So when we look at disaster risk, it's kind of this formula of, risk is a hazard times the vulnerability. So the bad thing that's happening times, the vulnerability divided by the capacity to cope. And I'll give some specific examples. If you're in an area with high chronic disease and it's really hot and the lights go out, you have a lower capacity to cope. You have more sort of social vulnerability, health vulnerability. And so there have been some studies looking at things like public electric vehicle charging in California and solar panels. California's actually done a lot of studies on these. And what you find is that it's very accessible in wealthier and typically wider areas, and in majority minority communities and lower income, it's actually less accessible. And so I think this is something we really have to be very conscious of. I know I'm sort of sidestepping the question, but I think that a lot of things, when we talk about climate and resiliency, they are very accessible and very easy if you have a high capacity to cope or have high access to resources to begin with. Equity is probably the most accessible to start with, is making sure that everyone has access to these solutions, because it's very uneven right now. And by simply it's extraordinarily hard, but by addressing on issues of equity and access to these innovations, access to energy efficiency services and things like that in ways that make all communities available to it, you actually get a large proportion of folks who currently can't access things that other people are accessing in droves. So happy to chat more on any of that. I've been doing a deep dive with some work in the energy sector and seeing a lot of that specifically around energy security, but I think it happens in a lot of different areas, and even the incentives we provide. So a tax write-off for investing in this energy efficient appliance. It's great if you have the money to put up front and you have enough of a tax burden that you actually realize that savings. But if you don't, and a large portion of people don't actually pay enough federal taxes to even realize that tax benefit, much less have the money to put up front. So understanding how we're creating access could actually open the door to a lot more adoption of what's already out there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a really interesting take on the question. I completely agree that accessibility is key. If we want to go in the order that we went before, Johanna, if you'd like to go next.
Sure. And I would just echo a lot of what Jeff said about this idea of accessibility and what that means, and accessibility for whom and where matters a lot. So one thing that we think about a lot at the center and in some of the I work a lot on adaptation. So this word resiliency is often applied to how we respond to something hazardous. And I know there's a question coming up about the difference between adaptation and mitigation, but I'm seeing that come up in this question also. So I think a lot on this resiliency side of the question. And when I think about climate resiliency, I think about the multiple types of hazards that places face. So things like flooding due to sea level rise, due to coastal storms, due to tidal inundation, due to groundwater table rise, extreme rain events, and also extreme heat. And one thing that's really interesting in this work is how I think a lot about design and the built environment also. So one really interesting thing and somewhat devastating thing is that the way that we've built and constructed cities and how we live in a material way often produces the risks that we have. So for example, when we pave over the streets, or we build certain types of housing as sort of a cut and copy way of making cities, we not only introduce flood risk because we decrease green infrastructure and the absorptive capacity of a place, but we also make it more prone to heat. And what's very unsurprising, unfortunately, is that those high risk areas are also the people who Jeff was describing who have the least resources and least capacities to cope. So all these things compound on one another. So I think one strategy is more of a way of thinking about how we think about risk also, that these things are all very, very related, and thinking about how they compound on one another. And I think when we start to do that, it becomes more feasible to think about how one strategy can achieve many things at once. So when we think about water risk, right, we want to slow water down. We want to retain it. We also want to make more green spaces for people, healthier, cleaner air, reduce heat. So how do we think about sort of nature or infrastructure as achieving the reduction of risk in multiple ways, given what we know about how we've built cities in the past or built the way that we live in the past. So I think those types of things are sort of more ways of thinking that lead to better, more feasible outcomes.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an amazing answer. Christina, if you'd like to go next.
Yeah, happy to, although hard to follow that. That was a very, very good answer. Makes me think about a lot of things. But maybe I'll just focus on the sector that I work on refrigerants and cooling appliances, because it is actually one of those sectors where resiliency and mitigation are actually pretty tightly knit. So from a mitigation standpoint, the way that refrigerants and cooling appliances contribute to climate change, it's basically two ways. One is the refrigerants that we use, the chemicals that are circulating in our appliances. They are extremely potent greenhouse gases. And just to give you a sense of scale, a pound of R134A, the refrigerant that a lot of our fridges have in, warms the climate 1,400 times more than a pound of CO2, which means that even in very small concentrations, we're doing a lot of damage by using these chemicals. And then the second way that cooling contributes to climate change is through electricity use, and especially if you're in a place where the grid is not clean, you're using fossil fuels to power those appliances. So these are two areas where we're working on to reduce the climate impact, to mitigate the climate impact of cooling. But from a resiliency standpoint, access to sustainable comfort cooling and sustainable cold chains are critical. So, and when I say comfort cooling, it's not just about actual comfort, which is a very subjective thing. And you should ask my partner, who can never understand how I set the thermostat at 80 Fahrenheit. But it's protecting vulnerable populations when a heat wave is in effect. And it's important to remember that maybe in the US, we're used to all homes having access to air conditioning. In India, only 6% of households have an air conditioner, which means that infants, older folks, people with underlying conditions, they do not have access to a cool and comfortable environment during high heat events. And then cold chains, we use a lot of refrigeration there, and they're crucial because they preserve our food and they make sure that medicine is shipped around the world and it's not spoiled. And this is a sector where we're actually, you're asking what is feasible within the United States. We are making a lot of progress in all of these fronts. We're phasing down the use of these refrigerants, and we're replacing them with much climate friendlier alternatives. We are establishing energy efficiency standards. Jeff mentioned some of those, like these apply to cooling appliances as well. There are certain incentives that help to give people access to these appliances, especially for lower income households. And we're also trying to electrify cooling with the proliferation of heat pumps, which in combination with a cleaner grid, which we're also fighting for, this will bring us to a much, much better point. And I think that is to show that climate resilience and climate mitigation often overlap, and it's important to be thinking about it as a whole, because at the end of the day, they are both working towards the same thing. We want healthy communities thriving in a healthy planet. And so we have to be thinking about all of these things in conjunction, and we certainly have to be thinking about what Jeffrey said in the beginning about access to these services. We know how to get there. We need to also make sure that everyone has access to that. It's not just something that few can afford.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I love how you got specific within the realm of your work. And I think it's really great that we're moving towards a more resilient future in that regard. So Jennifer, if you'd like to close this out again.
Sure, yeah. And I'm going to very much stick with my own wheelhouse in my answer, although like Christina's, there's a similar theme here where resiliency and mitigation very much go hand in glove. And so obviously what I'll focus on is the role of the natural world in both resiliency and mitigation. Which until I think in recent years, it's sort of shifted a bit, but had been framed as really the forgotten climate solution, but one that is really indispensable to meeting global climate targets and to also achieving the adaptation and resiliency that we need to respond. And so in terms of, what natural climate solutions are, they're basically strengthening and protecting the ability of the natural world to be both mitigating and storing carbon or greenhouse gases. So for example, the Canadian boreal forest stores twice as much carbon as the world's oil reserves. So it's absolutely critical to be keeping that carbon locked up in order to avoid really runaway climate change. And we often see, industry and other folks talking about sort of tree planting or wooden buildings and long-lived lumber as sort of the favored modes of natural climate solutions. But really what the science shows is that protecting existing ecosystems is the most effective, one of the most efficient ways of achieving climate change mitigation. And that's also true on the resilience side. These intact primary forest areas are far more resilient to growing climate impacts like fires and invasive species than our forests that have been previously logged. And so protecting these forests both, keeps that really essential carbon locked away and also protects the forest from those future impacts. And we're especially seeing this in places like British Columbia as well, where you have really catastrophic flooding and mudslides in areas where the forest no longer exists. And this is very much, leaving communities devastated and unable to adapt to the changing conditions on the ground. So from both of those standpoints, the protection of the natural world, especially under Indigenous-led protection and guided by Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous knowledge, is a really critical piece of both mitigation and resiliency.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry if you can hear the music playing outside of my apartment right now. But that's an amazing answer, and I love that approach. So if we could go to the next slide. I'm sorry if you can hear that from outside. But what do you think that are the benefits of climate resiliency? What do you think are the benefits of climate mitigation? How can these movements work in tandem?
Do you want me to jump in?
Yeah, if we want to go in the same order. I feel like it's been working.
Sure. All right. No, I this is really an interesting question, and I think my fellow panelists have kind of covered this in the last question as well too, on how we can look for win-wins in each of these, which I think is really important. When we talk about climate mitigation versus adaptation, it's funny, in the resiliency and the disaster management world, mitigation means something. So there are a lot of definitional issues. So climate mitigation is about reducing harmful decarbonizing the grid, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation is adapting to the bad things that are going to happen, being ready for them, flood walls and, disaster planning. And the disaster world, mitigation is actually that first order protection, building flood walls, putting submarine doors on the subway so they don't flood and things like that. With this question, the notion of climate, I think it's good that we're thinking on both sides of the coin now, and it's actually a fairly new thing, and it's actually a problem that it's a fairly new thing. So for a long time, it was very difficult to talk about climate adaptation because it meant you were throwing in the towel on climate mitigation. It meant that you were giving up on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so while we're behind and really, frankly, not going to achieve the greenhouse gas, the targets that have been set for greenhouse gas reductions, it's useful to have those targets to keep accelerating down and create benchmarks and things like that. But I think we're even further behind on adaptation, and having that conversation about the investments that need to be made and the building practices that need to be made. Because much like climate mitigation, you have to have some of these things can be done on short order, right? There are some things that can be done quickly, but when we're talking about reducing harmful greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the things we do today may take a decade or more to really start to have full effect and be brought to scale. And the same thing with adaptation. The things that we can really do at scale to build resilience has to do with, urban planning and building codes and how we design cities and restoring natural ecosystems. And so that also takes, decades and sometimes even generations to bring together. So I think that I hate to be a bummer here. I'm sorry, guys. It's been I will say there's a lot of short order things that we can do to help accelerate this. There's a lot of investments coming in within the United States, and the bipartisan infrastructure bill has a lot towards decarbonizing the grid and more sustainable transportation, et cetera. Should the Build Back Better legislation go through, that's got other components, particularly on the social environment, that are really necessary. But also in the immediate term, we're very vulnerable, and there's not a lot of ways to avoid that. So I think we also need some investments in disaster response, disaster recovery, and reducing a lot of the inequities in disaster response. Because for some things, there's a lot that we can do to build a brighter future, but there's also some things that at this point are largely unavoidable. And so we need to be ready on how we're going to respond and how we're going to work with communities and in the recovery process. What was being worked on in New York after Sandy, to build back better, to use these resources that come in for rebuilding to bake into that some of these resilience building aspects. So a little bit of positive, a bit more negative. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. We'll take any positives we can get in terms of climate change and climate resiliency. Thank you so much. So Johanna, if you want to go next.
Sure. It's a really good question. And I think they really have to work in tandem now. One thing that sort of strikes me and comes to mind, and I really love, Jennifer, what you said about Indigenous wisdom and knowledge and the importance of preserving and conserving natural resources. Because I think when we think of, it's a perfect example of how these things can work together. And as it relates to climate resilience and adaptation space, and both, frankly, right, these terms are important because they're also shaped by how we think about climate change projections in the long term, right? So the data gives us time scenarios of what to expect. And that's helpful not only because it helps set those targets for mitigation, but they also help to shape a way of thinking about what we need to do in the future that's sort of pushing us to not think so short term about the investments that we make and what we do. So when I think about climate resilience and adaptation, it offers two really important things. One is a way of thinking more long-term about what types of investments we make and how we make them. So when we think about correcting for this way of thinking about cities, for example, that has like the city here and the nature out there. Climate resilience offers an opportunity for us to rethink that paradigm. It also offers an opportunity to think about how we build, construct, conserve in ways that are flexible. So maybe it's not a flood wall that's needed, but maybe there's a short-term solution that can buy us some time to a more flood adapted, more water sensitive way of thinking about a coastline. It also offers a really important opportunity to think about who receives those investments to correct for some of that inequity, right? So who leads the decisions and who leads the design as it relates to what neighborhoods and communities, villages, cities look like in the future. So climate resilience and sort of accepting that a change is gonna happen offers empowerment to rethink who decides what that looks like. I think that's sort of a lens that I try to bring all the time. And here in New York, we're seeing that even in our own neighborhoods quite a bit.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's an amazing perspective as well. Christina, would you like to continue?
Yeah, certainly. I actually want to go off of something that Joanna just said, which is, who decides what that looks like. I think that a lot of us in the policy advocacy space, we spend a lot of time thinking about how to change the minds of those who decide. And a huge part of it is communication, is how you frame issues and how you frame the solutions. And the fact that so far we've been talking about resilience and mitigation as two separate issues. And, Jeffrey mentioned at the beginning, it used to be an either or, not just separate. I think that is quite harmful in actually getting decision makers to the place where they need to be, where the necessary effort is going to be put in solving these issues. And so I think that it's incredibly important as a community to start communicating this as something that, these two issues are intertwined. It is way too late to ignore resiliency and adaptation. It is not, we've done so much damage already, unfortunately, and it's really a bummer to think about, but that is the situation that we find ourselves today. We have done a lot of damage, and no matter how quickly we mitigate, we are still going to experience some pretty challenging circumstances. So there's no excuse to not be focusing on climate resilience. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we're giving up on mitigation. We're doing everything we can, and we're going all in trying to avoid additional climate damage. And switching that framing and communicating that consistently to decision makers is incredibly important. And I think it's what our community and what everyone needs to start doing and try to frame these like that. And I'm actually really happy that this discussion is happening today, because it gives us a chance to air a kind of a slightly different perspective than what we hear most of the time.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Jennifer, if you want to close this out.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm gonna slightly sidestep the question in a way, because I do sort of, as the other panelists have talked about, see them as sort of one and the same, especially in the realm of natural climate solutions. Protecting primary forests achieves both ends. But in terms of the benefits, I mean, I think that's a really important conversation to be having. For a number of reasons. I mean, one is of course, we're not just facing a climate crisis, we're also facing a catastrophic biodiversity crisis, as well as continued human rights crises around the world. And in terms of the biodiversity crisis, as recent international reports and scientific panels have shown, we cannot be tackling these independent of one another. And what these natural climate solutions around resiliency and mitigation both achieve is the protection of the natural world in a way that addresses both the climate and the biodiversity crises, and simultaneously brings about the kinds of transformative changes to our ways of thinking about and valuing the natural world, and to the kinds of marketplace and economic dynamics that we need to be seeing in order to arrive at a safe and sustainable future. And then the other benefit that's really, again, inextricable from all this is that climate change, the biodiversity crisis, they're all part of and due to and contributing to colonialism. And none of that, this is all the product of centuries of disempowerment of Indigenous peoples and basically erasure of their worldviews and ways of life, and replacing them with this unsustainable system that we have today. And the work that our NRDC is doing, and so many others are doing around natural climate solutions, is really following the leadership of Indigenous peoples who have been leading the way on this already for decades, long before others were doing so, and who have the on the ground wisdom and have the sort of modes of thinking that are essential not only to tackling both the climate and biodiversity crises, but are also essential in order to achieve the kind of reconciliation and addressing the centuries of colonialist worldviews, and really achieving the kinds of empowerment, sovereignty, and self-determination that Indigenous peoples have been long overdue to have. So those are just some of the co-benefits. I hate to even call them co-benefits because they are front and center of these solutions, but they all sort of work together, and that's true in both the resiliency and the mitigation space.
Great, thank you so much. Very encompassing answer. Jareen wants to read the next question.
Sure. So for our next question, we wanted to ask you guys, what are some obstacles you face in trying to pass resiliency policies or in taking action? And for this, anyone, you guys can go in order, or anyone can jump in and just answer.
I can go ahead. I think about this a lot because it's very challenging generally as a field to have picked, because I think you have a lot of awareness about the urgency and transformational change that's needed, but we have a culture of like incrementalism, especially in cities as it relates to city planning and decision making. And that can be very, very hard and challenging. I also think that there are challenges in this work, frankly, as it relates to that term feasibility that came up earlier in the questions, because a lot of times we think about, at least in the spaces in which I inhabit and work a lot in, feasibility is often defined by like the ability for us to physically construct something, or to move something, or to change the way that something looks or feels, or how you walk around in it, or how you engage with it. And feasibility is really determined by like a set of values and trade-offs that are made by somebody in a position of power. So how much it costs, what interferences it has with utilities, for example. So people will tell you it's not feasible to plant trees because they conflict with the utilities that are underground, or it's not feasible to flood a park because we don't have the resources we need to maintain that park. So I think that it really comes to like thinking about like who defines that word, because that's often where the decisions get made, and really thinking holistically about what the trade-offs and costs are and who decides what's too high of a cost and for whom. So I think this is where we get to like an empowerment piece and a consensus building and like democratic systems also. Someone asked a question about like radicalization and democracy in this work. I think that we'll really be tested, and we are being tested in our ways of building consensus and in upholding the value system of who gets to decide what's possible and in what time frame, and who sort of like bears the legacy of those choices, which I sort of think about a lot as it relates to these decisions that have to get made.
Yeah, if anyone else would like to jump in on that.
I have a lot of obstacles, so I can jump in next. I mean, there's too many to run down in this session today. It would have to go on for several hours, but two to focus on, or I guess the main one to focus on, is the problem that plagues so many facets of policy nowadays, which is just misinformation and greenwashing. And this occurs at both the government level and at the industry level and the corporate level. And I saw Mary Pearl's question about the corporate commitments on climate. And so in the Canadian context, we have a bit of an uphill battle because everybody's perception of Canada is that it's this green haven where, there are these global leaders on climate, biodiversity, and Indigenous rights. And in many ways, they are among the worst actors on all three fronts. Canada has the third highest intact forest landscape loss in the world, behind only Russia and Brazil. They clear cut over 1 million acres of boreal forest every year. Their species like boreal caribou are plummeting. They're obfuscating the full scope of their climate impacts from industrial logging. And this is also being exacerbated at the provincial level with provinces that are very much captured by the logging industry. So we're very much having to fight up against this perception that all is well in Canada. We don't need to do anything there or in the rest of the global north. All we need to focus on is tackling problems in the tropics. And that has sort of been perpetuated by the global north over the past 30 years through the ways that they define things like deforestation. When you clear cut a forest in Canada, it's not actually technically deemed deforestation, whereas when you clear cut a forest in Brazil, that is deemed deforestation. So we have an inequitable global dynamic that is perpetuating this perception that we don't need to be worried about the global north. And then the other one is industry greenwashing, which aligns with some of the points I already made and has very much fed into the government's ability to be greenwashing around this. But they've also been co-opting terminology around things like natural climate solutions, and really got ahead of the game over the last decade in terms of defining what these solutions entail. So things like that I already mentioned, like the tree planting initiatives and the need to cut down forests so that you can plant lots of younger, faster growing trees without considering where that initial carbon went in the first place, and the fact that it takes hundreds of years for a forest to return. And then pointing to things like long-lived wood products as a justification for more expansive logging. And that has then trickled down to other corporate levels, and Tareen knows about our work with the toilet paper sector and all their claims to sustainability while they're liquidating primary forests to flush them down the toilet. So I would say misinformation at both the government and the corporate levels has been our primary barrier, and it's just this very sweeping paradigm that we're having to run up against.
Yeah, greenwashing is a subject we've covered a lot throughout in our club and throughout our events. So I think that's something really interesting to our members. Thank you. If anyone else would like to jump in on that.
Yeah, I'll jump in a little bit. I think that, I obviously I agree with my colleagues. One thing I would add too is that there's a lot of oversimplification of the issues and the solutions. And I think you see a lot of this in those who oppose and addressing the comment on sort of radicalization and demonization of climate science. I think you see that coming particularly from industries and areas with a way of life that is under existential threat by decarbonization. I think there's a place for some empathy there, not with the bad actors, not with the folks hiring lobbyists to get climate change stripped out of bills. I mean, there's some crazy stuff happening that is just straight up wrong. But there are communities that are not in very good standing to begin with from a socioeconomic perspective that don't have a viable alternative. And the language has gotten so heated on both sides that it's tough to really appreciate those stuck in the middle of this and who are aligned with the anchor industry in their community because it's their way of life. And again, I'm not trying to say we should give a pass to, really abhorrent behavior, but there's an oversimplification that I think prevents us from getting past. I always say we can't get where we need to get with 51% of the population. The other thing too is that, I think the private sector and government in general is a very mixed bag. So I say this because, I'm actually doing a lot of work with the private sector within Columbia and outside of Columbia, where I've been brought on board and they're saying, look, we need to be able to make the case to investors on why this is worth it. What is the value of resilience? What is the value of decarbonization? Because from a strictly two-dimensional calculation, using the calculations now, this isn't a viable investment to regulators or to shareholders. But if we can demonstrate the value in reduced health effects, in reduced, if we can create modifiers for these investment decisions that include sustainability, that include climate and resilience benefits, we can put them forward and we can look at this more systemically. These questions are coming to me from for-profit companies. Not nonprofits, not advocacy groups, for-profit companies that want to do this and are trying to use the mechanisms and the transactions that they engage with to have a more accurate sort of valuation of resilience and climate adaptation so that they can do this. They know the issue they're trying to. And I think that if we're able to unlock that there is a tremendous, there are levers of change far more powerful than grants and regulations. And if those market incentives can be tipped, it can be incredibly powerful. Now, again, I want to be very clear. I'm not trying to let folks off the hook for greenwashing and really abhorrent behavior. I will say too, in response to some of the questions on agriculture and farming, I think it's important to note too that a lot of these things that we demonize today were celebrated when they came out. Plastics dramatically reduced the weight of shipping. Large-scale agriculture dramatically decreased food insecurity and increased nutrition. A lot of people were left out. It was very inequitable. I'm not trying to say that it wasn't, but I think that it's there's an oversimplification that we see very much on the climate opposition and the climate deniers. But I would say too that on our end, we're not completely innocent with that respect either, and sometimes get drawn into oversimplifications that might ultimately undermine our ability to come up with really meaningful and engaging strategies. Because right now, the level of polarization we have now being right isn't enough. we need to be inclusive in that.
Yeah, I actually want to build off of what Jeffrey just said about oversimplification, because I wholeheartedly agree that there are issues with that, and it is unfortunately happening. And one thing that it is allowing to happen is more and more politicization of policy. Policy doesn't have to be politics. And the fact that unfortunately climate has become an issue where there's a clear divide amongst different political inclinations is a problem, because everyone's affected by it. And the fact that a lot of the problems and a lot of the solutions are oversimplified means that it's easy for people to feel like they have to pick a side and stay there. And it doesn't allow for all the nuance that is actually needed in that dialogue to have meaningful discussions and create meaningful solutions that are inclusive. And I think that avoiding that oversimplification without entirely overwhelming people when we're talking about these things is a very hard balance to strike. But it is something that all of us have to put some effort in doing. And I think that applies in everything. It's not just in the climate space, but understanding nuance, finding nuance, and being comfortable with positions that are not necessarily black and white is the only way to get to discussions that truly make progress, even if you don't entirely agree with the person you're discussing with. And I think that's just gonna make us better humans, make us better participants in our communities, and you know, have societies that are more inclusive, both on the climate front and on many other fronts.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think oversimplification is the death of all good thought in any realm, and especially in climate resiliency and mitigation. So if we want to move on to our final question, what recommendations would you make to those wanting to work in climate resiliency or policy, and how can students begin to enter the field?
I can go. I think you already have. Like in being in this group and in convening like this, I think you already have entered the field. And I think it was Christina that said before, like curiosity and evolution is it can be hard because it's uncertain, the path, but it is the path forward. And I think one thing that, even just to build on the last question, is this is some of the challenges, but also is the thing that we all have to cope with in the reality is I would recommend getting comfortable with uncertainty, that we all have to get a lot better at coping with what is an increasingly uncertain world, that we have climate projections that help us anticipate. They're projections, they're not predictions. And these, you know, what we're seeing today is that the effects of climate change and the realities can be unexpected also. So I think sort of inhabiting a space that's comfortable with a level of uncertainty and flexibility in how you think will benefit you a lot. I also think this kind of just goes to like just how to move forward, but there's a lot of work to do and a lot of angles to come at it from, and there's no right way. So the choices that you make about where you work or who you work with, whether that's in a corporation or in a law firm or at a university, all of this change needs to happen at every scale and at every institution. So I would say, you know, you have to find the thing and the angle that speaks to your sort of personal story and what you are activated by, because we need your passion and your insight and your thought and your perspective at every scale and in every institution. So there's no right or wrong path to take or place to find yourself or work to do. It's all needed. I guess that would be sort of my recommendation.
I would just add in, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, we need all the help we can get, and whether it's disasters or the lens of climate change, there's no field that this doesn't touch. We need artists, we need lawyers, we need urban planners, we need academics, we need everything. We need politicians, we need anyway, again, I'm sorry, it's probably not a helpful answer to say there's no wrong way to go, because you still got to pick one. But that being said, I mean, look at the paths that all of us took, and none of them were a straight line from A to B. I think we all had values that we enjoyed in what we do, not to speak on other folks' behalf, but things that we like doing, a dedication to the public good, and found these paths sort of along the way. We're undergoing a lot of these conversations with the creation of the climate school at Columbia and thinking about degree programs. And I've even thought about too, like, does the world need another disaster management degree, or do we need people in various aspects of civil society with more knowledge about disasters and their role in resilience. Because as you're hearing from this too, we're no longer in a world of consequence management where we deal with the issues after something occurred. We're trying to get upstream of it. When you get upstream of it, we're talking about, as you've heard the other panelists say, generations of structural inequities. We're looking at economic policy, educational policy, how all of these things intersect, and what are the transactions that we engage in that accumulate into more resilience or diminished resilience. Who does that affect more? Who can access things and who can't access things? There's a place for this in virtually every career path. So I think I don't think there's a wrong way to go. And I think going down one path doesn't keep you from changing paths if that's not the direction you want to go in, or you don't find out that you're where you want to be. The final piece of advice I'd give, that I give everyone, is that there's a lot of really great, passionate people doing great work for great reasons. Life is too short to work with assholes when you don't have to. Find good people, work with them. If you find yourself in a situation where it's very toxic, learn from it and get the hell out. There's plenty of good people to work with out there.
Yeah, I could not agree more with all of these things. And I think the only thing that I would add to that is, which is related, and it's both something to help you in building a career and to preserve mental health. I would urge everyone to find their community in this. Find a group of folks that give you inspiration, a safe environment where you can discuss things. Entering the space of climate policy has some very dark days. We all face some pretty existential questions, and we're all in it and fighting for something better because we believe it exists. And I really liked your framing, Joanna. These are projections, not predictions. And it's very true, but we're dealing with some difficult questions. And so finding humans that are going to help you go through this and process this and thrive in a space like that is incredibly important. And if you're here watching this, I'm assuming you're already doing that. But I think that's important to cultivate throughout your life, to just, not lose your mind.
I don't have too much to add on top of those already really great suggestions. And I don't know that my advice is really particular to climate resiliency work, but I guess I would have three things. One is give things a chance. Don't just sort of reject things out of hand. Either because you don't have any experience in there, or it hasn't, previously aligned, or you feel like you don't have any contribution to make. You do, by taking that chance and just at least experiencing something, it completely shift your approach and can open up whole new avenues for you. Like, I never thought that I would be working in Canadian environmental policy, but I'm very, very glad that I took on that opportunity. Very closely related is, own your space. I know imposter syndrome, especially, early on in your career, can be a big hindrance. You're just getting started. You feel like you don't have that much to bring to it. You absolutely do. Own your contribution, own that you have a unique voice to bring, and make that voice and contribution heard. And then the third one is, don't do things just out of expediency. I know that there's sort of seem to be like a very clearly defined path to getting to environmental law or environmental policy, and one thing follows the other. But hopefully, one thing you might take away from this panel, from all of our backgrounds, is that that's not the case. And by doing things like theater and film and having robust backgrounds and absorbing a lot of different experiences and types of disciplines and approaches, you can bring so much more to the field. And environmental work is the quintessential intersectional field. So the more diverse experiences you have to bring to that, everything lends into that work. So follow your passions, follow what you want to do, and you'll bring something really unique to the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I personally found all of that advice extremely helpful, and I'm sure all the rest of our students did as well. So just to bring it to the end of our formal questions, and now we're going to move into our Q&A session from our students. I know some people typed their questions in the chat, but if you guys are here and want to read them out loud, that would be great. Sam wants to read her question first.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, sure. So I had a question about the CRA. It's something I've been focusing a lot in the last couple of months. So I was just wondering if you think that the Community Reinvestment Act, if you're familiar with it, can be used to incentivize, I'm sorry, I'm so bad at that, banks to invest in low-income communities that have been especially affected by climate change.
On my end, I'm not intimately familiar with the Community Reinvestment Act, which I guess is a fancy way of saying I don't know much about it, if anything. I will say in a lot of schemas sort of targeting low-income communities, on the one hand, providing resources that sort of tip the scales that are beneficial for that sounds really, really good. What we find a lot in the disaster space is that a lot of times the intent is good, but the bureaucratic process to actually apply for and get funding can be absolutely overwhelming for smaller communities. So we see that with like the BRIC funding and the mitigation funding, where a lot of communities that really need help and would be eligible for even zeroing out 100% funding, they can waive the matching requirements, can't even pull a proposal together because it's so technically complex and an area of already diminished resources. I don't know if any of that actually applies to any of it, but I would say it you know, on the surface, it sounds important. And I think these are good ways for government to put their thumb on the scale of market incentives to make things more viable and investments more viable. How they're implemented is often at least as important, if not more so, than the legislated intent. And with taxpayer dollars, it's often quite a hurdle to get funds.
Yeah, I might just add to that. And Tareen, I bet you probably have a perspective on this too, based on our work together at the center. But I don't know a ton about the mechanics of the CRA, but I do know that an underlying assumption and direction for that money is to neighborhoods that were historically redlined in cities. And like I said earlier, right, when we look at climate hazards and risks in cities and neighborhoods, exposure to extreme heat, exposure to flooding of all sorts, exposure to poor public health outcomes, they also overlay pretty directly with the historic redlining maps in cities, which were intentional policies to discriminate against housing loans and mortgages, and deed restrictions based on race and ethnicity. So at its core, right, the CRA sort of reads as a correction of investing back in those communities that were left out of wealth building opportunities, which is a big part of climate justice. But to what Jeffrey said earlier, it's how those funds are spent, in whose hands they get. And it's sort of, that's where we sort of see the opportunity and also some of those challenges of making sure that they're spent wisely and not recreating the same sort of hurdles and risks and vulnerabilities as were created before.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you guys so much for answering my question.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I just want to get to the next question so we have time to get to all of them, if that's okay. But Dean Pearl, if you'd like to say your question out loud, or if you'd like to, if you'd like me to read it, let me know.
No, I'll raise it. I just actually I used to be dean here. I'm out at Stanford, and one of the things that I've done has been talking with executives at Danone and organizations in Brazil that are basically fulfilling carbon credits that companies pledge by these Brazilian forests, and also research activities such as trying to develop more regenerative agriculture in the countryside, including reducing the degradation of lands through cattle dairy farming by developing a husbandry that's forest-based, and then also perennial plants in agriculture, and all kinds of measures to reduce the carbon footprint of these companies that use a lot of agriculture, like Nestle and Mars and Danone. And I know I'm just wondering what you think of the promise. I heard, talk about greenwashing, but I think there are in place certification programs that are pretty stringent. And on the other hand, is it too little too late? I just like to hear the experts on this panel talk about what the promise is, what the possibilities are for the corporate sector to move the needle towards the 1.5 target. I think for too long, people in the science community, which I'm a part of, or people in government really looked at policy and didn't really look to groups like the Consumer Products Forum or these corporate groups, or in France, they have this category of a company called Mission, Entreprise à Mission, which sort of gives companies that really focus on environmental sustainability a break, and so they don't have to be pushing for short-term profits. And so I think there's a lot of movement in the corporate sector, and I'm wondering, we've talked about the fierce urgency of now with the environment. What is the promise of all these efforts that are just seem to be getting underway?
So I think about, if folks remember in the late 90s, most of you probably don't, but in the late 90s, there's a hamburger chain, Jack in the Box, and had a big E. coli scare. A number of people died, E. coli 0157H7, and everyone was like, oh, where's the FDA and all of this? Why aren't they regulating? And then you look into it and it turns out they don't actually have very much authority, because a lot of it had been stripped out of regulation. And even the authorities they had, they didn't have the funding for the inspectors to actually inspect the beef. And so there were all these calls to legislate more aggressive and more money and things like that. McDonald's looked at the hit that Jack in the Box was taking from the bad publicity and said, look, you're going to meet these safety standards or we're not going to buy beef from you. Overnight, the industry changed. Not overnight, but over a very short period of time, the industry changed. Again, I'm not trying to romanticize capitalism as the fixer of all problems. It creates its own share as well too, but there are levers, there are mechanisms. So along the point that you're making, I'm actually very excited by them because I think it's untapped options. We've been pulling on the levers of politics and policy for a long time, and there's a lot of work to be done there and more to be done. But if the incentive structure can be altered and innovations that create competitive advantages. History is actually marked with these innovations, with dwarf wheat and the innovation of being able to have more grain per acre for very densely populated areas have been very, very transformative in the world. That being said, for every dwarf wheat, there's 10 more snake oil salesmen and things where it's gone wrong. But I think that innovation is something that isn't brought up enough. A lot of times we have to look at numbers that would require most of the world to stop eating meat or something like that. But there are a lot of innovations in the pipeline in terms of different methods of food production and regenerative agriculture and things like that I think could very well provide a modifier to that can might not require such dramatic and frankly unrealistic changes in behavior. And I think they're more likely to come from the private sector at scale. I think we've seen a lot of the tricks that we have for government, but not all the ones from the private sector. And if COVID-19, if there's any silver lining here with COVID-19, it's that there's a lot of data now in these corporations in terms of companies that are doing better and aren't. And guess what? It points to offering sick time, taking care of employees, building in a little bit more into resilience and things like that are creating competitive advantages. And so I think there's more we can do in academia as well too to help create the methodologies for doing that and look at it objectively. But I personally am very excited by it, which isn't to say that every idea is going to pan out, but I think that I think innovation is really the X factor, and it's most likely to come from the private sector.
I agree. Thank you.
Just a very quick perspective, because I know we're out of time. Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's a tremendously important role for the private sector to be playing. And I think, Jeffrey, you mentioned the investor commitments and the role of the financial sector in driving this large scale change. And we've already, seen that in the forest sector as well, with commitments around deforestation, but also growing commitments around forest degradation, including in the global north, that are sort of starting to shed light on this previously unrecognized issue. I think one of the biggest problems to achieving this is the lack of accurate data and accurate transparency. So right now, there's a lot of obfuscation of supply chains and a lot of really shoddy accounting practices that are happening specifically around forest impacts and forest carbon. And I won't say this is true across the board, but the Washington Post just released that really impactful report that showed that there's a tremendous gap between what countries are actually reporting and then what's actually being seen in the atmosphere. And 59% of that gap is in the land sector. NRDC just released a report showing that in Canada, the Canadian government is underreporting its forest carbon emissions by more than 80 megatons of carbon dioxide every single year, which is about 10% of the country's overall emissions. So I think until we get the numbers right, and until countries and also the logging companies as well are more, and the suppliers on the ground are more forthcoming and more scrupulous about the ways that they're accounting for their impacts on the ground, it's going to be very, very difficult to have corporate commitments that fully address these issues and aren't prone to things like leakage, additionality problems, duplication and the like. So just a little tinge of cynicism to add into that. I mean, I think there is a strong role, but there's also foundational issues that need to be solved first before we can really get robust, meaningful commitments in all sectors.
I'd say too, one of the reasons we're engaged is to help shed a light on some of the data disparities that, I mean, we talk to folks in the ES&G sector and they know full well that climate change is undervalued in it. And I asked him, I said, why are you still using this if you know it's wrong? And he said, we don't have anything else. So I completely agree and think that that's actually, none of this is possible with bad data. And it just keeps reinforcing bad decisions that people know are bad because there isn't a clear alternative. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Yeah, thank you all for your wonderful answers. But unfortunately, we're out of time for the Q&A. Just if anyone has any more questions, we were wondering if the panelists would be willing to put their emails in the chat. If any of our students would want to reach out, totally fine. No. But thank you all so much for being here and for your amazing answers and for your insights. And now we're here to announce our raffle winners for our t-shirts from our club. So if Veronica wants to share her screen and show us who won the raffle. Congrats, Renee. And go again. Congrats to Jonathan. Both of you are winning t-shirts from our club. So we'll reach out to you by email to get information on, give you more information on how we're going to send those to you. But again, thank you so much to our panelists and for everyone